Yeah. So after I became a black belt, after my black belt ceremony and that speech everybody talks about it and everything, I went through and I trained again pretty hard, and the usual thing that I go through in terms of my everyday practices as a jiu-jitsu practitioner. But then something changed because I start to look back onto my whole journey as becoming a black belt and beyond, right? And I start to actually go through the different stages of being those color belts, and then I start to actually, I do a lot of reading on my own culture, and I do a lot of researching on different topics. And I stumbled across the fact that, hey, our journey across all of our color belts and becoming a black belt and beyond is very close to an art form in Japan. There's a very unique art form in Japan. And I look at every steps of this art form, and it takes an arduous, very laborious step to actually get a good piece of art of this. And it's very similar to how we train starting from a white belt and becoming a black belt, right? And this art form is, it's the art form of katana making, right? And a katana, as people know, is the ninja sword, samurai blade, right? It is a Japanese sword. And the Japanese sword is made by many steps along the way to actually make it into that blade, make it into a form where they could actually kill people. And it's very ironic, something that is built in to kill people is an actual form of art in Japan, and is one of the most important pieces of art that's about to die out, actually. So it's very unfortunate. There's not many people who are actually taking on the art. One, because it costs a lot, and two, it's actually illegal to have swords in Japan. For art purposes, you're allowed to, but the fact is that it is a dying art, but it's a very special art to me, right? And the process of making a katana blade is actually in many steps, where I'm going to actually equate that to every belt as we get along to becoming a black belt, all right? So this is pretty interesting. To me, it is. I'll try not to put you guys to sleep, but katanas first start with iron ore, right? And the iron ore is called tamahagane in Japanese, which is a special kind of iron ore that they find in Japan. Only a certain percent of that amount of iron ore, a certain percent of the iron ore has to be in that sword to be called a katana, right? It's just like Bordeaux and Perrier and tequila. You have to have a certain amount of that tamahagane that is mined in Japan inside of that blade to be called a katana, right? And it is literally a billet of iron, right? And that billet of iron really has no purpose until it actually enters the swordsmith. Then it starts to go through the whole process. But that step right here, that clump of steel that is pretty much ineffective by itself, is you, when you first walk through those doors, signing up to become a white belt, right? Not refined, it's just a clump of steel. You could throw yourself at somebody and cause damage, but not too effective, right? So this is where the actual process starts. The tamahagane goes through a whole quelching, firing process where they heat it up until it becomes red hot. Then they start to hammer it, right? And they quelch it. Quelching is actually putting it in water, right? They pull it out, they heat it again, and they hammer it. They quelch it again, put it in water. And they do this process over and over to take out the impurities and take out the voids of the actual, the metal itself, right? So it becomes nice and refined. They start to put carbon in it, right? It becomes carbon steel. Carbon steel is what the steel they use in knives recently, right? Cutlery knives, they have carbon steel in them. They put carbon in it. They put all the other alloys into it to make it steel, right? That whole step right there is your journey, where it starts when you are on the mats as a white belt, right? Because the fact that you can't do anything, you're pretty much lost, right? But you're being beaten, you're being quelched, you're being going through a lot of process where you're saying, why am I going through this, right? But it is a very important process, because in the steel, you start to actually hammer out all the impurities, all the voids, all the air pockets, and all the molecules of the steel start to align, right? This base is probably the most important part of not just the swords, the lifetime of the sword, but the lifetime of you as jiu-jitsu practitioners, right? The fundamentals that you learn as a white belt carry with you to you becoming a black belt, right? I use the moves that I learned as a white belt even now, right? So that's how the process starts. You take this billet of iron ore and you start to actually refine it. You hammer it and you refine it, right? And that's pretty much the stage at which everybody is a white belt. Then you move on. The sword moves on, right? And it's a very unique process where it, as a sword, what they do is they take the actual billet of steel, now refined, it's a clean piece of steel. They start to hammer it out. They do the same firing, right? They put it under a ton of fire, right? They stretch it out, they fold it, quelch it. They do the same thing again. They hammer it out till it's thin, fold it, and they quelch it. And they do this over and over and over times. And they do this so that they can make layers and layers and layers of these molecules of steel to create a very strong, very flexible a base in terms of a sword, right? This whole process, right, this whole stage is, I think, when you're a blue belt, right? You have refined moves that you can use, right? But now they're starting to kind of mesh together finally as a blue belt, right? You start to learn these moves as a white belt, but they didn't really connect. But as a blue belt, you finally start to connect these, and they become, right? They start to become the shape of a sword, right? The folding process actually takes a long time, because think about it. You're taking a piece of steel, and you're heating it up, you're stretching it out, and you're folding it. That's one fold. Many of these katana blades that are out that renowned in history have been folded 800 times. If you think about it, that's an arduous process, right? And it's the same thing. As a blue belt, I remember on the mats, I was struggling, trying to survive, right? Knew a couple moves, didn't know how to mesh them together, right? But as we start to practice, it became better and better and better, right? So that's the whole process then. You start to actually have this sword-like shape, right? You could kind of swing it at somebody, you could hit somebody, but almost there, maybe, right? So then, from that process, you move on. You have a billet of steel.
Go ahead. I promised my daughter she's going to be here, but she's not here, but she's here. Can you guys say hi, Julie?
Everybody's watching. So then, from there, you have a nice refined piece of steel that's folded many times, right? And now you do this process called a hiire process, where what the swordsmith does is he takes on a layer of mud onto where the blade is, right, on both sides, right? And then puts it into a very hot flame. This hiire process, when he does that, it creates two different things. One, it creates that heat difference between the blade and the spine, right? When you put it into the fire. That creates a very strong, stiff blade, but a very flexible spine, right? The beauty about a katana is that it could pretty much cut a bullet out of the air, right? It's that sharp. The blade is very, very sharp, right? But a lot of the times, sharp swords and hard swords are brittle too if they get hit from the side. A katana, you could shoot it with a gun from the side and it would actually wobble because the spine is so flexible. That hiire process, where it takes two different temperatures in order to quelch the blade and the spine, creates a very sharp sword, but also a very flexible sword as well, right? Very similar to jiu-jitsu, right? Jiu-jitsu, yeah, you are trying to actually, be effective with very strong, very deliberate pressure, right? But at the same time, you're trying to actually adjust and flex with the person, right? And become this big wet blanket on top of them, kind of smother them, right? Very similar to that in concept, right? The swordsmith here is very interesting. The swordsmith puts the layer of mud on in different shapes. You can make it a wavy kind of cloud formation, a fiery formation, a mountainy formation. And if you're able to kind of catch real katana blades in a museum next time, look at the blade part of it, and the blade part of it has a nice pattern on it. That's deliberate. That is a deliberate kind of creativity of the swordsmith. We put that on purpose in order to create that form of shape. A lot of them are very creative if you could think about it. They have different shapes where it's like waves and everything, right? That is the creative process where the swordsmith puts his flavor into the sword. That process, the hiire process, and the actual patterning process, I would actually equate that to being a purple belt and a brown belt, right? Purple belt more, I'd say, right? Because purple belts and brown belts I've seen many times, you start to develop a style. You start to develop your own game. You start to develop what works and what doesn't work for you. So it's very interesting rolling with everybody because everybody has their own kind of book that they go by. It's very interesting to read and kind of interact and roll with you guys because I like that. I like that a lot. And that whole process in terms of hire or making this nice pattern on a sword is very similar to that, right? So now it's starting to actually become a sword, right? It is starting to function as a sword. And now we come to the last step, which is the most important step of the katana making process, which is sharpening and polishing, right? From here, the swordsmith kind of goes to the side. There is a person dedicating his life to sharpening swords called a togishi. This person's job, sole job, is to sharpen swords. That's it. And he would take one sword, he would work on it for a year or 2 years, just sharpening and polishing the sword. If you think about it, that is insane, right? That's your job, right? And that's no wonder why there's just a dying art, right? But that process is taking all those things that you built in, the folding, the patterning of it, and actually polishing it so it actually stands out, right? So when you go to it next time, you actually can see a sword, you can see the patterning, right? You can see the shine, you can see the sheen, you can see how light reflects in everything. And that is all deliberate by the actual swordsmith and the polisher. The polishing togishi can actually make certain parts of the blade shine and certain parts of it dull, right? So you can actually smith it in a way where you can actually make the best, the potentials of the sword shine, right? And of course, that step in the jiu-jitsu world is becoming a black belt, right? You take everything that you had and you built up until now as a brown belt, all your fundamentals, right? Every hip movement, every leg movement, every arm movement, every leverage, right? And you're starting to refine it. And when I became a black belt, it was exactly that. It was relearning everything, going back to square one and taking all the moves that I learned and actually refining and polishing, taking one step, taking my hand here to here, made a hell of a difference. My hand here over to here, my hips here, made a big difference on everything, right? And that's the whole process of what a blade goes through in order to refine it and to make it into a katana, which is very similar to what I saw as a black belt, becoming a black belt, going through beyond a black belt, and actually starting to refine everything. And that's what it's been about. These couple of years being a black belt is actually going back and relearning many of the things that I learned, right? And in closing, I'd like to say that, hey, we can't, right, do any of this unless we have people, unless we have fire, unless we have hammers and quelches doing this for you, right? Every one of you guys are my fire that actually keep me trained, keep me going, right? So, and I hope that I am to you guys because that refines our steel. And as Jay said once, you know, steel sharpens steel. It really does, right? You're not going to get a sponge to sharpen steel. You're not going to get us to become hardened steel with anything else than steel, right? So this environment, this class, this school the academy that we belong to is something special because that's what it creates. That's what it builds. We're a bunch of katana blades.